on behalf of Doing Sociology, I welcome you all to this interview. Uh, Me and my colleague Rituparna, today we're talking to Professor Surinder Jotka on a very pertinent theme, that is of the current farm laws in the country and the whole movement which has been going around it. So he's going to help us today look at the whole situation, the whole farmers issue, and the current farmers movement from a sociological perspective. So thank you, sir. Thank you for taking time out to do this interview with us today. We're extremely glad to have you here. And before we begin, I just tell you a little bit about Professor Jotka. Although all of you must already be aware of his writings, his works. So he's currently teaching sociology at JNU, and he researches on caste and agrarian change and issues of rural India, also questions of community identities. And some of his publications include Contested Hierarchies, Caste and Power in 21st Century India. Uh, and he's also published a handbook of rural India. He's the editor of the Rutledge India book series on religion and citizenship. And he's the recipient of the ICSSR Amartya Sen Award for Distinguished Social Scientists. So thank you, sir, again for being with us. And without much delay, we begin this interview. So, our first question to you would be, uh, the fact that, or the idea that Indian villages is where India resides, or the villages is where India resides, has been popular for a very long time, particularly immediately after independence. So, do you think this notion still holds true?
Uh, yes and no. I mean, the sense that Indian village is still a very substantive reality. We've actually just published a book which is to remind that. This book is called India's Villages in the 21st Century. This came out in 2019, Oxford University Press. Now, there are two aspects of it. One is the substantive demographic aspect of it, and the second is the very idea of India being land of village republics as a colonial construct. So I think the idea of village itself is quite problematic, and India never lived in its villages, in the sense that India lived in villages. India also lived in towns and cities. Urban life in India has been very old. I mean, in 15th, 16th century, perhaps more people lived in cities in India than they did in Europe. And that, in some sense, needs to be foregrounded, because India was more rural in the early 20th century than it was in the 17th century. And that changes the very idea of this, the way Gandhi popularized this idea. I think that was completely wrong, because rural never existed in isolation. There were villages, but those villages always were part of the regional economic formations, regional cultural formations, regional social formations. Marriages, for example, were to be outside the village. People did not, they were village or endogamy. So people interacted with each other, and they also went to the towns. I mean, cities were very vibrant centers, they were pilgrimage centers, but also administrative centers, also places where people would be visiting for various other things. So I think there were kind of regional social formations where villages were very important, but not Indians, all Indians lived in villages. And then there were diversities of rural settlements. You go to hills, for example, you would find very tiny rural settlements with 5 households, 10 households, at the most 50 households, because there are no houseable plots. And similarly, economies are such that you need to kind of, stay away from each other, because that's where your livelihood will be. You go to Kerala, you have contiguous homesteads, because this is a coconut economy, and then you would live with your plants. So you don't really have villages the way we think about villages in plains of North India or in Tamil Nadu and Mysore, where anthropologists did their village studies. So I think anthropologists also played its role in institutionalizing the stereotype that it is only through village that you can study India. And that's why we did not do urban studies until like 1990s. There were very rarely some urban studies. So one needs to kind of have a proportion. And the opposite happens now after the 1990s. Only thing that you talk about is Bangalore, Hyderabad, Gurgaon, and you don't talk about rural. Yes, urban centers have grown in numbers. Urban centers have grown in significance. Their contribution to national economy has gone up, but rural hasn't declined. Right? Even though proportionately or relative size of rural has declined from say 80% or 85% at the time of independence to 67% or 68% or 70%, or even if it is now 65%, the absolute size of rural is very large. It hasn't declined at all. It has actually been consistently growing. So rural India is like, nearly 80 crores people, right? That is very, very large. The numbers of rural population, people who live in villages. Similarly, agriculture, again, the same kind of problem with agriculture. The contribution of agriculture to the national income has come down to like 13, 14%. And the entire primary sector will be 15, 16 or 17%. But the number of people who remain tied to agriculture is very large. I mean, even if it is not your only occupation, or even if it is not your primary occupation, land remains a very valuable asset for a large number of people. So even those, for example, migrant workers who do what we call as the circular migration, they come and work here, they still have half an acre of land in village in Jharkhand or Bihar, which is very critical for their family reproduction, right? The family works there, they lease in some land. We did work in Madhubani or Bihar, and this pattern was very clear. So families are able to reproduce them even biologically by combining these two sources of income, a migrant worker working in Delhi or in Punjab or in Bombay, and family back at home with women and old people trying to cultivate land, and together at some level that becomes a household unit. So I think that is something which we need to remember, and perhaps the recent movement by farmers, ongoing movement by farmers, would perhaps remind us about the significance of agriculture, both socially as well as economically and demographically, because these are large numbers. This is like still more than half of India, of the entire Indian population, who are tied to agriculture in one way or the other. And this new language of economics, which translates everything into numbers and then reduces the worth of a sector by looking at its proportions, does, I think, a lot of damage to the actual realities on ground. And I think the political process also needs to recognize the significance of rural, significance of agriculture. And I think as a profession, we also need to recognize. Initially, if you look at our department, Center for the Study of Social System, there was a lot of research on agrarian change. There were courses taught. Very few people now work on rural processes. I mean, we have completely given up more or less that, as if it doesn't matter. And that's why it's difficult to make sense of what is happening, because you think that rural is now insignificant. Why should we waste time on agriculture? Why should we waste time on rural? And this also then gets reflected in policy priorities and priorities of the middle class opinion makers and stuff like that. So it's a very important question the way you have framed it, and I think it needs to be asked to ourselves individually as Indian citizens, but also from social sciences, from you and me need to talk about it so that rural can be given its due.
So when we speak of the rural, immediately we also think of the farmer, because it's all about agriculture in a way. So do you think that there is a sense in which how we approach the rural as well as the farmer, it's very homogeneous, and it sort of comes across in how the state does it as well?
Yeah. No, I think this is even more important question, because this comes to us partly from our professional tradition, in particularly in sociology. Actually, if you look at the folk tradition, the way rural is looked at, it is never associated with farmer. I think the problem partly lies with the way, in some sense, village studies in sociology, but also beyond that, in social movements, left-wing movement, try to equate village with peasants. Right? So idea of peasant society, which in some sense is the way rural studies are carried out through the framework of peasant studies, tends to then look at every household as a peasant household. And peasant households are in Central Europe, where the category evolved, were small cultivators working with their family labor, primarily for their own consumption and for some kind of, rent which was paid to the feudal lord. No, that's a very problematic generalization, and all kind of people use it in village studies, from functionalism to kind of left-wing activism. Everybody talks about peasantry, and we also continue to talk about peasantry in media, in newspapers. Indian rural has always been very differentiated, right? You might have heard about Lenin's idea of peasant differentiation. So peasant differentiation happens in Russia and China with the coming of capitalism. Not in case of India. India was actually not a peasant society. Yes, peasantry, one can use that word. Agrarian is very, very significant aspect of the village. And you cannot think of rural economy without thinking about agriculture and without thinking about land. But nearly half of rural in India, almost everywhere, except perhaps for some pockets, has always been landless. And that is because of caste. So you have this very strange kind of division. People who do caste studies or who talk about village, sociologists, anthropologists will talk about caste, and those who talk about peasantry and agriculture, they don't even visualize the reality of caste. I mean, we had very popular mode of production debate in Indian agriculture in 1970s, mostly among left-wing Marxist economists. There was hardly any discussion about caste, right? So it is assumed that everyone who lives in the village is a peasant, which is empirically not true. I mean, which is again another fallacy, and that we have been perpetuating even in our academic life. So what has been the life of all those people who have never owned land? Yes, they worked on land, but they also did other things, right? They were artisans, they were singers, they did all kinds of jobs. And this is something which has only accentuated over a period of time, right? So you have, for example, a whole entire artisan economy, which was at some level seen as caste system, and therefore their skills were completely downgraded, right? Even for themselves, those skills became a source of stigma. So even when you can work with iron and steel, and or you can work with a potter, for example, in urban middle class, pottery might be a fancy hobby, but we have had potters who have been potters for generation. So instead of adding value to it and kind of working on developing pottery as a global art, which India could have perhaps done globally very well, we actually, in some sense, induced a guilt in them, not a guilt, induced a kind of stigma in the occupation, because it is seen as somehow low status, or people who make shoes. So there was this whole different aspect of caste, which either are completely ignored, but even when recognized, they are recognized in this new framework of modernity, through which only formal technology trained engineering becomes valuable, but inherited skills, which are as much engineering as any engineering would be, are never encouraged and never in some sense upscaled. That would have been possible if we had not thought through this kind of colonial elitism, which became part of our life in everyday life. But at the same time, thinking about village through these differentiated economies, right? These possibilities existed of visualizing the village differently. If our nationalist leadership and elite and middle class elite had visualized village differently, then perhaps investment should have also been very differently. Those occupations were valued by the state, by the larger economy, then perhaps they would have produced different kind of outcomes for the entire society, right? So we stigmatize them, but at the same time, even today, village continues to be internally differentiated, right? Half of rural does not own land; it does other kinds of things, right? So, for example, in the latest economic statistics will tell you that larger share of rural income comes from rural non-farm sector. Now, this is a very kind of flat number. We need to figure out what does it mean, right? What is rural non-farm sector? Is it factories? Is it something else? So that is something which again is an empirical question which sociologists and anthropologists need to frame very differently, right? They need to empirically go and engage and then see diversities. It's not like rural differences are similar everywhere. When you go to Bengal, they have a particular kind of, again, within Bengal, there could be 2, 3 different kinds of trajectories of rural transformation and rural settlements, right? There are tribal pockets where there could be one kind of rural settlements. There are plains and there are rural settlements which are closer to town. They're very large rural settlements. In Bihar, you have villages which have population of 30 and 40,000. Right? So these kinds of realities require thinking in a decentralized manner. Right? Instead of having a centralized state and planning commission which would think for the entire India and then visualize what would work as a scheme or program for poverty alleviation or rural development, this has been one of the biggest tragedies of independent India. So we needed to decentralize substantively in a very different way, where local governments were given resources and they were given also genuine autonomy to kind of figure out their problems. And you should negotiate to make sure that autonomy does not mean the power is taken up by the local dominant caste, or rural is also, since it is differentiated, it is also hierarchical, it is also unequal, right? So all those questions we were aware of them. Even now we know them. It's not like we were, even in Constituent Assembly, there were discussions around this. Ambedkar had raised this question of caste when Gandhians were talking about giving village autonomy. That doesn't mean that you should not decentralize power. Right? You cannot have one single planning system in a country like India with so many climatic regions, so many historical, ecological realities, which make rural very different in different regions of India, and their relationship with the larger local economy, regional economy. So I think all those things needed, all the potentiality. So not only you have regional ecologies, as we were just discussing, within the village, different occupational groups have different kind of potentials. Pottery, for example, could have been pitched at a global level. And pottery has a lot of potential. Pottery could be mechanized. Pottery could be part of middle-class drying rooms, as we already do. And one could have thought about many other things if we had produced engineers internally. But that imagination does not exist even today. Right? So we only stigmatize those occupations, and then kind of, we think that we have modernized ourselves. But what do? They become part of the larger informal sector, and they are illegitimate even when they are selling their pots in the city. So they're neither here nor there. They kind of, become at some level redundant populations and marginal to kind of Indian economy, etc., etc. So those are at some level very dehumanizing processes.
So at this point, perhaps it's also pertinent to ask you about the question of the market. I mean, how the entry of the market has sort of transformed the relationship between the rural and the state, the farmer and the state. And how do you, look at these transformations over the years?
Yeah, again, for me, question of region becomes very, very critical. That, market relationship with rural and agriculture varies significantly from region to region, from crop to crop, and from class to class, right? Everyone does not relate to the market in the same way. If we were talking about agriculture, we know that there are farmers who are very small cultivators. There are small cultivators that we all the time talk about, small and marginal farmers being 80% plus of India, but there still are very large cultivators, and the proportion of land with large cultivators is much larger than their numbers, right? So they, for example, would own, if they are 5% of the rural agrarian population, they would own something like 15 to 20% of the land. So there are different kinds of what one should say classes, and that class becomes very critical in context of market, because it depends on how much land you have. And then it is not just the amount of land, it's also quality of land, what kind of land you have, what kind of crops you produce. And then ecological regions again become very important. For example, hilly areas or in states like Kerala, where not only land quality is very high, its ability to produce spices and other high value crops is very high, right? So it depends. So land is just a kind of nominal indicator. The value of that kind of asset varies significantly from region to region. So keeping all that in mind, one needs to look at this relationship. And the second point is that this thing is not something new. For example, if we are talking about Kerala, we know even in the 5th century of Common Era, there were traders from Arab who were living in Kerala, right? And they were trading spices from Kerala to Europe, right? So to think of, the way we are taught in our classroom that peasant agriculture was self-sufficient and self-generating, and then marketization happens only with modernization process during the colonial period. Yes, during the colonial period, there was commercialization of agriculture of a particular type, and then post independence with green revolution, that integration increases. But we need to kind of think of markets sociologically and historically, right? So this is particular kind of commercialization of agriculture that happens with, say, for example, cotton production, because Britain needs cotton from India after industrial revolution, and that has certain kind of consequences for Indian agriculture. But again, it varied significantly from region to region. They also developed regions like Punjab, where they set up canal colonies. But if you look at Bihar and Bengal, these were the most prosperous region of India in the 18th century. And they became among the most, what one should say, poor pockets of agriculture. Even today, if you go to Bihar, it's very surprising that Bihar quality of land, even if you're just traveling in a car or a train, you see it's one of the best in the world, because these are Gangetic plains, right? But productivity of land is very low because state did not invest in developing its capacities. There are hardly any dams in Bihar. There are no canals in Bihar. So you have one year, you have floods. Next year, you may have drought. So people don't produce much. Land productivity still kind of can go significantly up in these regions. So again, that depends on the way state has engaged with rural in different parts of the country. Punjab was identified, Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, parts of Gujarat, where Green Revolution was introduced initially, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra. These were pockets that were identified as having potential for high productivity. So they enforced paddy cultivation on Punjab farmers because most Indians ate rice. So rice was required, and therefore they were asked to produce rice, and rice was given a support price, and they started producing rice. And now you want to withdraw your support price, so they have a rice crop which is destroying them every day, every season. They are exploiting groundwater more than it can be, and that is creating different kinds of crises. So market is not simply a question of getting into market and becoming modern. It has all these other ecological, social, and other kind of political sides to it, where state and its interests and its own priorities, and also global, in some sense, advices that we get from other institutions, they also play their role. So I think one needs to, again, needs to empirically and academically engage with these questions. And part of the reason why these things have not become our priorities is also because middle class academics have completely abandoned rural as a concern.
Thank you for that answer. Now that brings me to the recent or the ongoing agitation against the farm laws. And, the movement has been considered as one of the biggest social movements in probably the last 2 decades in the country. So, and in your writings, you've referred to it as a new farmers movement, and you differentiate it from the peasant movements of the 20th century. So could you elaborate on this? Why this differentiation?
This is not my differentiation. This differentiation was made in 1980s when these movements came up. See, peasant movements, which again, as I said, I have problem with the idea of the word peasant as well. But historically, in the early 20th century, all over the colonized world, peasantry became a very important actor. Right? Initially, for example, in the left-wing writings of people like Karl Marx, peasants were seen as incapable of any kind of political agency. And then you have Chinese Revolution, Russian Revolution, where peasantry seems to have played a very important role. And everybody became excited about peasantry as a revolutionary agent, right? But they were all, in some sense, movements which were for political transformation. There were movements around question of land. There were movements that were asking for structural transformation in agrarian relations, social relations of production, as Marxists would call it, or the larger political system that decolonize, and we need our land to us. Say, for example, even in India, you have people like D.N. Thanagre and R. Desai who studied peasant movements in the 20th century. People like Gandhi mobilized peasantry for freedom struggle. You have movements in Telangana and Tibaga and several other movements which were led by communist parties. All of them were at some level working for some kind of a structural transformation, revolutionary transformation. They were focused on land question, right? Land needs to be, relations on land need to be changed. Now in 1980s, you have the rise of a new kind of uh, agrarian, and that agrarian is basically what we were earlier talking about, an entrepreneurial agrarian. It is always men that we talk about. He is producing whatever he's producing on farm for the market, and he is connected to market. His economy is linked to market, and his farming decisions are entrepreneurial decision. For example, if we're talking about paddy, if you produce paddy, the chances of your earning from 1 acre is say 50,000 rupees, and if you produce some other crop, 1 year it could be 70,000, other year it could be. So you think about, you take production decisions are calculated, and you have inputs to buy. So you have this new relationship which agrarians develop with market, and that is of price, that how much you pay for what you buy and how much you get for what you sell. So the entire agrarian politics shifts from land question to price question, right? It was first articulated by this chap called Sharad Joshi in 1980s, who said that this is a struggle between India and Bharat. Bharat are the people who are living in villages, and through unequal exchange, that what they buy from the market is of high price, and what they sell in the market is sold at low price. There is a kind of exploitation of the rural by the urban elite, and terms of trade are basically pitched against agriculture as a sector. So farmers are not losing their land. Farmers are not fighting on land question. They are primarily fighting on price question, and their politics is for a kind of structural renegotiation rather than structural transformation. That we should be at some level protected by the state. The third thing is state becomes very critical. So they're not asking for overthrowing of the state. They're not asking for change in agrarian relations, but they are asking state to help them sustain their economy, make their economies viable through intervention, so that in a market economy they can survive and they can flourish to a limited extent. So in that sense, this movement is also at some level approaching the state to protect them from corporate capital. And state seems to be, in their perception, favoring the corporate capital. And in this context, then it kind of becomes a totally new thing. And I think at some level, there is also something new in these movements in particular, because this is not simply a question of price. They're also raising political questions, even though, for example, in Singhu border, if you go, if you're a politician, you're not allowed to speak from the state. So they have a tendency to stay away from electoral politics, but it is becoming political. Second point is that these are trade unions. These are not really revolutionary parties. A trade union is a focused politics around interests of its members, right? That's how they are initially imagined and mobilized. So that's why they don't like politicians to come and speak from their stage. They would say, we are apolitical. You can't have a movement which is apolitical. Obviously that is, and they know that they are not apolitical in general sense of the term, but they don't identify with any kind of ideological politics as we understand it. But that doesn't mean that they would not have it. The people who join these movements, they come from different kinds of political contexts. There's some leftists, there's some right wing, there's some whatever. So they do bring their politics along, but On the whole, I think farmers' movements, some people don't want to make this distinction. And I think this distinction is critical because old peasant movements were movements around question of land and land relations and transformative in nature. New farmers' movements were, as they emerged in the 80s, and I think they continue to be even today, are around question of price, and their target is state. They are not anti-state. They are actually asking state to protect them from the market forces.
Okay, so when we are talking about it, the discourse on the rural has also been such that it is juxtaposed against the urban. So there is a sense of looking at the villager as naive, whereas the urban as, the urban person is educated. So in that sense, this has also lingered on in our perceiving and how we have looked at the farmers movement, the current one. So, can you talk a little bit about this discourse and how it has impacted the study of the agrarian?
Yeah, I mean, this is at some level, we already talked about it. See, the way India, in some sense, becomes a modern nation state, India's leadership goes to new urban professional. And they're not simply demographically urban professionals, they also have certain kind of urban elitism, right? So we have the idea of modernization and development, which at some level sees urban as already developed and rural as sites that have to grow up, right? So you in some sense infantilize the rural, you call them traditional, you call them incapable of thinking rationally. So I think this is built into the hegemonic narratives of the urban elite, who at some level constitute India's what one would call ruling elite or ruling classes. And that's where we stand. And that's why there's so much insensitivity. And I think this insensitivity is not simply a kind of mental problem, it is institutionalized. It is institutionalized in Indian policies, it is institutionalized in the idea of development, it is institutionalized in our imaginations of good life and future life. So that is something which is a problem of the urban elite, right? And obviously it makes life difficult for those who are not urban elite, right? It's not only the rural, they would similarly think about so-called scheduled tribes, they would similarly think about peripheral regions. For example, when you think about Northeast, you other than you think of Northeast as people who are incapable of having a larger vision and worldview. You think about Kashmir, you think in similar way. So there is this kind of elitism, which is at some level very hegemonic and very what one should say exclusionary. They think that we are the ones who would decide what is good for you. And I think farmers, apart from fighting for their interests, also are forced to kind of then fight for these kind of against these stereotypes. And now we have seen in last 3 months state itself playing those kind of songs where they publicly say that these are people who are not capable of understanding how good it is for them. Well, these are not really very difficult laws to understand. I mean, you just need to spend 2 hours, and farmers will tell you immediately, instantly. And anyone who has done field work, irrespective of the context, all agents are knowledgeable agents. As sociologists, we know. You talk to anyone. I mean, it's not simply about farmers. I have done field work with agricultural laborers, and they'll tell you they know already what we call as Marx theory of value. And I actually have done that. I mean, I have evidence of that. And we talk about power in politics. Women will tell you what is sexism, even when she is absolutely no idea of what feminism is, even when she has no idea of gender politics. She may not have the category of gender, but you just need to talk to a woman wherever she is, and she will tell you when it is violence and when it is pleasant, when somebody talks to you, when somebody looks at you. So it's not like people don't understand. I think this whole idea of some people being educated, some people being rationally aware, this itself is a hegemonic idea which comes to us from a particular kind of cultures of hierarchy and culture of inequality, which is also reinforced by modernity in 19th, 20th century, and our colonization in some sense makes it sacrosanct. Bureaucrats know about everything, and lay person is given this feeling that you don't understand rules, you don't understand laws, and therefore you have to be at some level told about them, and you have to be punished if you violate them. Everybody knows, everybody figures out what is good for them, what is bad for them, because that is their life. They are the first ones to understand how it is going to impact them. So I think it's a much larger problem, and it's a problem because we are not a democratic society. India is an extremely authoritarian society, and that authoritarian culture uh, pervades everywhere, in our blood, in our minds, in our households, in our streets, in our nation state, in our cities, in our designs, in our food cultures. Everywhere you would find that kind of elitism, which is very hierarchical, which is very, at some level, exclusionary. And that's something about which I think your generation is already talking about in a much more forceful manner. And I personally feel very hopeful that there is kind of, democratic consciousness is growing, and people are recognizing it's much easier to talk this today than it was 20 years back.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. We are actually nearing towards the end of the interview, and as we were talking about democracy, we are also in the pursuit of making the discipline more democratic in that sense, catering to young minds. So our last question would be that, what would you like to share with people who might be interested in studying the agrarian now? Do you have any sort of advice for them?
Yes, I think advice is a wrong word. I don't think anybody should advise anyone. We should remove this word from our vocabulary if we want to be democratic. Yes, we have. I have my experience that, but
Okay, maybe
as I say,
suggestions, not
yeah,
advice. Yeah.
as I say in the classroom, don't work with preconceived notions, right? A lot of our theory is completely trash, and just because Western literature is written in a language which is hard to understand, doesn't mean that that is superior. And I think, as we were saying, that if we are all knowledgeable, and all of those, or anyone who has done field work would know how in the field people sometimes know much more than what we know about the subject we are studying. So I think we need to be more grounded and more empirical. Look around us. Reading is required, but reading is required with a very clear understanding that we also need to know about others. We also need to know about what is happening in United States of America. But just by reading a scholar a French scholar does not make us a sociologist, right? If we want to do sociology, if we want to do social sciences, then we have to ourselves do social sciences. I always kind of, in my classes also, I give emphasis on engaging with the empirical, right? And empirical doesn't mean that what is visible, empirical is much more than what is visible. Engaging with the reality and trying to figure out, trying to imaginatively figure out. Imaginatively figuring out means, why the hell are they sitting on these borders? Don't begin with a judgment. Don't begin with a judgment that, yeah, these must be stupid people, and these must be, misled people, that they are sitting here and they are dying in cold just because there are some leaders who have told them. So don't fall for these easy answers. So that's where I think we in methodology courses often talk about avoiding value judgment, right? So not judging people, trying to go and seeing them as they say, but that doesn't mean just what they say is right. It is for a social scientist is to critically and imaginatively try to understand those things. And that comes through interaction. That comes, we are capable of engaging with each other. So it's I think that is what is required. And that's what, say, if you look at any other society, there are people like us, you and me, and many others who play a very critical role in making societies better places to live. And I don't think any social science is out of politics. We are all doing politics, but that doesn't mean that we have to engage in electoral politics and we have to be, ideologically motivated. We obviously have our own ideas and our own values. We can't escape them, and we should not, because that is where our moral, whatever strength comes from. But at the same time, as social scientists, particularly as sociologists, last thing we should do is to judge people, right? We need to engage with them, and we need to understand the way, say, somebody like Max Weber would talk about putting yourself in their shoes, and then kind of have the confidence that we are doing sociology, and this sociology is as valuable as what Weber was doing in the 19th century or the early 20th century. We are at some level better equipped than Marx was when he was writing about his society. He did very good job, but that was for the 19th century Europe. Or there are concepts in Marx which are very useful today, but we need to look at them in our context. If we have to talk about Indian agriculture today, how do we use category of class? How do we use category of, say, status? How do we look at dynamics of capitalism and market economy in the 21st century? So that is our responsibility. It doesn't make them irrelevant in any way, but we need to have the confidence of engaging with the empirical. All of them did empirical work. You look at, we teach them as theorists, but none of them did theory. They were all doing empirical work. Sociology has to be empirical. Marx was doing empirical work. Weber was doing empirical work. Durkheim was kind of looking at data of suicide among these. And then you imagine that these are possible explanations, and explanations are always possibilities. You don't have laws in social sciences. And I think we need to have that kind of confidence, and we need to not only see us, but also see us in relation to the larger world. And what we theorize here can be perhaps useful for studying German society, or can be useful for studying American society or Dutch society. There are some concepts, if we can use their concept, they can also use our concept, or we can also study their realities. And I think thinking globally, thinking comparatively, but only after being located locally, not in that sense celebrating the local. I don't like that there is nothing called local, but in the sense that you have your own context, and working with that confidence that, yeah, we have the capacity. I think we have bright minds. We have very, very brilliant, good. I have very good experience with my students always. And it's very easy to understand those things. I don't think we need to always kind of be part of this camp or that camp, and I follow this literature or that literature. Follow yourself. I think we read everything, and then kind of produce some sociology which is critical, which is imaginative, but which is also empirical, and which is comparable to other kind of social contexts.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. We really are honored to have you here, and thank you so much for your time. I hope after this discussion, a lot many more young people are interested in studying India's villages as well as the rural with fresher perspectives, hopefully, from the discussion. Once again, thank you, Professor Jotka, for being here.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful discussion.